Hello. Thank you for joining us for Unite for Sight's Conversation with Innovators. We are thrilled to have all of you with us here today. My name is Jennifer Staple-Clark, and I'm founder and Chief Executive Officer of Unite for Sight. Our panelists today are judges for the 2016 GHIC Innovation Prize, which is a $10,000 and a $2,000 cash prize for the two best pitches presented at the 13th Annual Global Health and Innovation Conference at Yale University on April 16th and 17th, 2016. All conference registrants, both students and professionals, and both nonprofit and for-profit organizations are eligible to apply for the Innovation Prize. Early stage pitches are eligible for the $2,000 cash prize, and established stage pitches are eligible for the $10,000 cash prize. This Innovation Prize supports outstanding ideas, programs, and organizations which are locally developed and locally responsible. Today's webinar will not be designed as an information session that simply reiterates the information already on our website. Instead, we will hear from the Innovation Prize judges about their guidance, mentoring, and advice regarding innovation, program development, and program design. Regardless of whether you're specifically applying for this year's GHIC Innovation Prize, you will glean important insight from this remarkable panel of experts about designing and developing new programs and organizations. I'll start by very briefly introducing you to Unite for Sight, review the webinar logistics, and then we will hear from our expert panelists. Unite for Sight is a global health nonprofit organization that promotes high-quality care for all. And as I had described, Unite for Sight has an annual Global Health and Innovation Conference upcoming in April. And the conference website, abstract submission, and registration details can be seen on our website at uniteforsight.org/conference. If you're interested in applying for the GHIC Innovation Prize and have not yet done so, comprehensive details about the prize can also be seen on the website. And the final deadline to submit a 250-word abstract for the 2016 Innovation Prize is on January 31st, upcoming in about a week. As described on the website, the highest quality abstracts that are written abstracts are thereafter invited to submit a 5-minute video application. Additionally, we offer a variety of other global health and social entrepreneurship education programs. Our Global Health University program includes a free webinar series, including today's webinar, and we also have 20 online certificate programs for students and professionals. And the certificate topics range from a certificate in global health and a certificate in global health research to a certificate in social entrepreneurship. We have a number of other upcoming webinars as well, and all of those details can be seen at uniteforsight.org/webinars. And two of the webinars that will likely be of particular interest to you, the audience, are upcoming on March 8th, which is dedicated to high-impact branding and marketing strategies. And then we have another on March 24th about perfecting the pitch. And both webinars will emphasize the importance of clearly communicating your ideas and programs. And the March 24th webinar will focus on how best to communicate in a short pitch format. Now I will describe some of the basic logistics of this webinar, and we are delighted to have all of you with us here today. We have incredible panelists, and they have a wealth of expertise to share with you during this next hour. And note that Bobby Jefferson had hoped to join us today as a panelist for today's discussion, but he's currently in the field in Cambodia and isn't able to access the internet connection, so he's not able to connect. But instead, he sent to us some insight that we will share on his behalf during the Q&A of this webinar. Each of our 4 other panelists will start by giving a 2-minute introduction about themselves and their key advice and lessons learned about innovation. And then we'll dedicate the remaining time to the questions and answers that were submitted by you, our audience, by Saturday's question submission deadline. We selected the most common and most thoughtful questions to ask our panelists, and we also invite you to submit additional questions in the text box on the left of your webinar screen, and then we'll select those questions to ask the webinar panelists as well today. And if you would like to tweet during the webinar, the hashtag is GHUWebinar, and you can see that hashtag in the webinar visuals on your screen. We'll proceed now with having our panelists introduce themselves. Paul Ellingstad, if you can please start by introducing yourself and offering your key lessons and advice regarding innovation.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So my name is Paul Ellingstad. I'm a managing partner at PTI Advisors. I've recently moved, from working on the corporate side of social innovation to now consulting to NGOs, to corporations and businesses, as well as to governments and universities on how to drive the social innovation process. I think what's particularly important when I reflect on what's really the secret sauce of innovation. It's about improving or enhancing, not just a product or a device, but very oftentimes, it's a process or a methodology. And what I've seen over the years is that very quickly, folks that are involved in innovation move from the problem definition, straight into the solution. And, what usually gets sort of tripped over is doing sort of the due diligence, saying that, once you understand the problem, before leaping into the solution and executing on, what you think is the best idea, for addressing the best solution for addressing that idea, look at the due diligence, who has come up with similar ideas, can you potentially build on some of the other solutions, or enhancements in the marketplace, instead of doing something completely novel, instead of, something that you've, fully designed yourself. So overall, in terms of, what I envision, really important criteria in terms of the innovation prizes at the upcoming conference, it's really a good understanding of what is the problem that you're trying to address, or what's the need that you're trying to address, and have you done the due diligence to fully understand, what other solutions, what other opportunities are out there in the marketplace, rather than just the single solution or the single idea that you've come up with yourself. Thanks, Jennifer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. And Jordan Levy, if you can also please introduce yourself and share your key advice and guidance.
Sure, absolutely. Once again, thank you for having me on this discussion. I think, first of all, just to introduce myself, my name is Jordan Levy. I am the Chief External Relations Officer for Ubuntu Education Fund. We work in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, with orphans and vulnerable children, taking them from cradle to career in a holistic and comprehensive fashion that prioritizes the depth of the intervention over the breadth of the amount of people we can reach. We've been doing so for 17 years, and I think we've been able to, over that time, build what I would consider an innovative model to do so, and it's really come from trial and error, and that's where I think my advice would come in, is that I think in the dialogue about innovation, often we are too focused on the idea. But if we were talking specifically about this sector, I would never stop the definition of innovation at the same level as an innovative idea. Innovation has to have a practical effect for it to be useful for the purposes that we set out and the goals that we set out to accomplish. I think often, and I think Paul touched on this, the idea is looked at and then we say, wow, that's a great idea. That should transform X problem. But the truth is that many great ideas do not end up having a practical effect. And what we need to look at is actually the full breadth of what innovation needs to be. It has to be a great idea in context where it will work, and the execution, even after the great idea is had, is quite difficult and quite complicated. And if we're to speak honestly about it, we need to see that. And I think we saw that in judging last year's sort of innovation prize, that we wanted to see an innovation that we thought not only was a great idea, but could actually work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jordan. And Charlie MacCormack, please introduce yourself and share your advice and guidance as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. And again, congratulations on the great work you and your team are doing. My background is 16 years as president and CEO of World Learning and the School for International Training, and 19 years as CEO and president of Save the Children, and currently an advanced leadership fellow at Harvard and the vice chair of the Sustainable Development Goal Health Alliance. I'm going to follow up on what Paul and Jordan began by saying, and in addition to the program-specific criteria that are mentioned in the materials, Jennifer, that you've distributed, it's the variable of ensuring sustainability over time. Most initiatives will not certainly achieve scale in just a few years. It's a multi-year process before you get into multi-country impact. So it's very key to identify a sustainable revenue stream that will be able to continue the basic costs of a program innovation over time, not just a startup grant or a year or 3 years, but what will carry the program forward. What is an entrepreneur's plan for gaining access to that revenue stream? What is a budget that's credible and realistic in terms of what it will cost to get a program off the ground while obviously not being added? A demonstrated capacity for leadership and whatever teammates are needed to sustain that leadership, and some insight into how legal incorporation, boards or advisory councils. Jennifer, you mentioned a webinar on branding and marketing, how those functions will be taken care of. So a lot of that leads to the suggestion of a potential established partner who might be taking care of your legal, accounting, finance, branding issues while you, the entrepreneur, implement your program without needing to spend so much of your time on the administrative side of things. So particularly the revenue stream and the administrative requirements of sustaining the initiative over a longer period of time. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Charlie. And Lisa Hirschhorn, please introduce yourself and also share your advice and guidance as well.
Sure. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Lisa Hirschhorn. I'm originally trained as an HIV physician and been working in quality and monitoring and evaluation both in the U.S. and globally. I'm currently at an organization called Ariadne Labs, which is a nonprofit that's been developed to create innovation but scalable solutions to critical moments in people's lives, and so really focusing on not just how we implement but also how we measure and how we improve. I just want to follow up. I think my co-panelists have really pretty much covered everything from the need to understand the problem and to do the due diligence. I think that's absolutely critical. I think a lot of times people have a great solution and then go looking for a problem to which to apply it. I think also the idea that one needs to test and to adapt. Often things that work perfectly in theory or even in one setting may not actually work quite as well, and you need to be humble about that and always be willing to learn. I think the critical of not just focusing on the intervention, but also how you're going to implement it, and equally important, how you will support the implementation. And then I think finally, from my perspective, that it's critical to make sure that you're measuring what you're doing, not just from a data perspective and in terms of quantitative data, what we traditionally think of as data, but also to listen to the community and listen to the people who are using the intervention and who are being impacted by the intervention to really understand sort of the acceptability and the feasibility, and make sure that whoever's asking those questions is not actually the person leading the innovation, because you need to get somebody that people are willing to sort of say, well, maybe it seemed like a great idea, but it's not so good, and we're actually not that interested, or it needs to be changed. So I think humility needs to be as important as creativity to really make sustainable innovations that actually will better the world.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And as mentioned, Bobby Jefferson had hoped to join us, but is in the field in Cambodia and isn't able to connect to our conversation today. But he has some insight that he has sent to us that we will share on his behalf. But he is director of the Center for Development Informatics at Palladium. So we will hear some of his insight as well. Now we will proceed to have our panelists answer the questions that were submitted by you, the audience. And if you have additional questions, please include those on the left text box on the left of your screen, and we will include some of those additional queries within the queue for questions today. We'll start with our first question for Charlie. What do you find to be good indicators that an idea or venture will be effective, possible, and also of excellent quality?
Great, yes. On the one hand, let me say, if I were listening to all these requirements, I might say I'll never start anything. So everyone had to begin with an innovation and a commitment and some hard work and the kind of due diligence that Lisa mentioned. And I would preface my remarks with that. But the more experience the entrepreneur has with the program and the ecosystem that they are proposing, the more convincing it's going to be. The more networks that they can demonstrate they've been part of, and the more kinds of partnerships they can potentially develop along the way, the better it's going to be. We've mentioned the importance of demonstrating local support in 2 or 3 moments here, and Lisa also essentially mentioned that. And that's key because so many programs that are dreamt up in Washington or New York or Boston or Geneva never have an impact because they don't have a knowledge of how it actually works on the ground, and they don't have ownership on the ground. And finally, the more vetting and feedback one can get, an entrepreneur can get about an idea, the more refined it's going to be. So for those of you who are throwing yourself into this process and will be getting significant feedback, I think, that lends a lot of credibility to a project. And not just credibility, but also substance. And to have several really informed people give critical feedback is really helpful. So those would be some of the variables that would increase the feasibility and the quality of a pitch and a proposal.
Wonderful, Charlie. Thank you so much. And Lisa, there are so many programs and organizations. How do you avoid reinventing the wheel, and how can entrepreneurs ensure quality over quantity?
So I think that's a really important question. And so I want to first of all thank the person who posted that. I think that, again, the key thing, it goes back to this idea of doing, due diligence. And it sounds like, not too tough thing to do. You go and you maybe Google a couple of things, but really understanding that where do you actually find out whether or not somebody's actually already in the space that you want to move into, and are they doing something that is already meeting the need or potentially could meet the need, and maybe if you actually partnered with them, that might be a better way of going about it rather than starting again. I think the answer is, again, you need to sort of talk to the community of people that are innovating in that space, not just from the innovation perspective, but also from the consumer perspective. There's a technique that's called snowballing, where you talk to one person and then you say, who else should I talk to? And so there's a way of sort of networking to understand what's actually out there, as well as doing that kind of due diligence by looking in the web and making sure you're sort of looking in all the different places somebody may or may not be spreading their word. I think the other thing is that it's very important to put in place the metrics that you have, how you will measure success, and knowing in advance sort of what direction you're going. So how do you define success? Because again, quantity is something as simple as, I distributed, multiple, how many thousands and thousands of pairs of shoes, but did that actually meet the need in terms of a sustainable way of protecting children from getting worms and other kinds of infections from going shoeless? So those would be, I think, my main two take-home points, which is, make sure you know how to do where the landscape already is, and make sure that the metrics that you put in place really reflect what you're defining as not just providing a service or an innovation, but providing one that's effective and that's acceptable and that's feasible, which are some of the core components of quality.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lisa. And Paul, how do you suggest balancing between being innovative with an organization's need to be focused, strategic, and risk-averse?
That's a really good question, Jennifer. When I think about that, first off, the last point, focused, strategic, and risk-averse. Being innovative is, almost the opposite of being risk-averse. I think that's, one of the challenges. You're trying something new, and oftentimes organizations, and particularly businesses, are trying to limit, the risk that they have. So first off, I think setting very clear objectives of, again, what is the particular need or what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and trying to put some parameters around, what resources, time, money, expertise, et cetera, are you willing to, invest and commit, over time, to addressing that particular problem or that particular need. That's probably the most important side of being risk averse, is setting those parameters and saying, we will go so far. We don't know how this is going to turn out, so we'll set some milestones and and sort of test along the way. In terms of balance against focus and being strategic. I would argue that, that is part of the innovation process, that, you absolutely do need to have, focus. That doesn't mean that you can't change plans, that you're not, sort of jiving and tacking as you go, but you have to be very clear on the problem and on the solutions that you're implementing. So the focus is actually part of the innovation process. And likewise, with being strategic as well, back to having those parameters, I think you have to be very clear, on your objectives and what you're willing to invest, but what you want to be getting out of the process as well. So in that context, you're not doing this just as sort of a trial and error. You're not tinkering. You're being very clear in terms of your intentions and your purpose.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. And as we've been discussing, it's very important for ideas, programs, and innovations to be locally developed and locally responsible. Jordan, what does it mean to be locally responsible, and what are examples of a program that caused harm because it wasn't locally responsible?
Sure. I think it is absolutely essential, and I think the concept is more simple than often we think. It's a matter of understanding the local context before you actually approach a problem. And I think it goes back to that more robust definition of innovation. It's excellent to have an incredible, brilliant idea, but there is a whole nother process of translating it into a solution that actually works. And one of the steps of translating into a solution that actually works is putting it into play in a context where it will actually be utilized. And unfortunately, often there is an excitement driven around an idea, or possibly driven by money or capital that's put behind an idea, whether that's because of a profit that's being made or because of funding that's being given. And the idea is immediately tried to translate it and implemented in multiple different contexts. And unfortunately, those often have negative effects, because sometimes a good or service or product, or even what could be called an innovation, is immediately flooded into a place. And we've seen numerous examples where, for example, a very innovative product could be put into a context where it then hurts a local economy. And I'm not interested in necessarily calling out one organization or another, but I think with a little bit of research, we can all find cases where local economies have been hurt, or a solution that works very well in a certain context, which, a medical solution or a psychosocial solution that has amazing effects in one context, isn't tested in a smart and piloted small way so that we can understand the effects it might have before it's rolled out on a large scale. So being locally responsible often has to do with trial and error. And when we go into any context, making sure that we test out on a small scale whether or not a solution will have adverse consequences before we roll it out to scale. Because once it's rolled out to scale, it often can set off kind of a domino effect that ends up doing more harm than good. So I think it's a simplicity of doing things in a measured process where Lisa talked about understanding what you're trying to measure and how you're going to measure it. Often that's best done on a small scale first so it can be understood and evaluated before this innovation is prescribed for all.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jordan. And Paul, when designing programs for resource poor settings, what type of local culture considerations must be included from the onset?
So I think this has been a common thread going out through the discussion so far about local involvement. Probably one of the urban myths or the misnomers about innovation is places like New York or Silicon Valley or London, those are the hubs of innovation, and these great ideas and new products and services are being invented there and then transported to particularly developing markets. First and foremost, again, this idea of don't start with the solution and then go looking for the problem. Understand the local context. The best way to do that, outside of being present, is also the co-design, the co-innovation, with local partners. Secondly, to that though too. We all come with a lot of baggage in terms of the assumptions that we make, even in the solutions that we create around our understanding of the problems that we're trying to address. That, too, is really important as part of this due diligence process that, by very actively partnering, with local, individuals and organizations, testing those assumptions that we're making as we go through the creation process for new solutions. Having the local partners actually help in the definition of the problems and then the co-creation of the solutions as well. So keep it as local as you absolutely can from the very get-go.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. And as noted earlier, Bobby Jefferson isn't able to join us live today because he's having internet connectivity issues where he is in Cambodia. Instead, he sent us some of his insight that we will share on his behalf for this next question. And the question is, what are essential lessons for navigating cultural differences that impact the success of technology-focused programs? And Bobby asked that we contribute this response for him. One of the key or central lessons for navigating the cultural differences that really impact the technology-focused solutions is both the realism of adopting and using a technology that came from outside, and now you're trying to use it within a country. Oftentimes, an approach that works in terms of a lesson learned is using a technology that has been locally sourced or developed in country and being able to modify your solution towards that. So that way there's a sense of ownership. And Bobby continues by saying that one example that he cites is that there was a solution where someone was doing patient reminders by a very fancy smartphone and distributed smartphones to many of the community health workers for patient reminders, and were able to send out text to remind it for adherence follow-up. However, when the program ended and the pilot project for that group finished, they did not have any airtime for the smartphones to send the data, and it wasn't planned in the ministry or the hospitals to commit budgets to include the data plan. So all of that work and effort just stopped and ceased. So having a strong lesson learned around having a simple technology things that they can afford is a much better approach to a longer, sustainable, impactful program. And Paul, perhaps you can also contribute your thoughts regarding navigating cultural differences that impact the success of technology-focused programs.
Yeah, there's a couple answers I'd have to this one. First is I'll use an example that late last year, Facebook had announced that they were going to have what they called 2G Tuesdays. So developers sitting in Silicon Valley, would be working on a 2G network to have a better understanding of some of the bandwidth constraints, for Facebook users in developing markets. It was interesting that, following some of my friends and colleagues in developing markets, had seen that and did sort of the collective, eye rolling of, nice attempt at empathy, but, that's not really going to get you that far in terms of developing better solutions, for developing markets. So the cultural, navigating the cultural differences, it's not, I think, just a matter of being aware, but I think to be successful it has to be experiential as well, and that goes back to this common theme of getting the firsthand experience, in the communities, in the markets, in the countries, where you're looking to be introducing new products and services. Secondly, though, too, I think one of the other chasms when we talk about the cultural differences, it's not so much cultural in the context of ethnicity, but I think one of the growing challenges that we have in terms of innovation is actually around, the age diversity, particularly in developing markets, with very young populations. There's less of a chasm or less of a difference in terms of, technology adoption for young people in, say, Nairobi compared to San Francisco than for young people compared to older people within the communities. So I think that's actually a greater challenge that we have. Again, not introducing solutions that, for a whole range of reasons, aren't going to be, easily adopted by, for example, older populations in that as well.
Terrific. Thank you, Paul. And Charlie, what are your suggestions for identifying quality partners from the onset? How should potential partners be vetted by an early-stage organization? And conversely, how do existing established organizations typically vet a program or organization that contacts them?
Let me begin by making a quick comment on this navigating cultural differences and introduce another factor, which is the nature of the innovation itself. Some of them are relatively easy across cultures, some innovations, some are not. And specifically as an example, vaccines and vaccine programs are pretty broadly understood around the world now, and typically don't interfere with strongly held cultural and political differences. So that would be an initiative that could probably be rolled out more broadly, more quickly. Whereas, in contrast, if one is doing something that's going to radically change gender attitudes, let's say, or educational curricula, those are going to be very complicated and require a great deal of local and national customization. So I would just want to introduce the fact that the complexity of cultural differences does vary from initiative to initiative, and it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of concept. On the question of quality partners, first of all, there's a distinction between international partners, the CARES or UNICEFs or TechnoServes of the world, and then national partners who you might work with in Cambodia or in Ecuador. So I would want to put that out there. I'm not going to take the time to discuss too customized strategies, but there are differences in how you get at partner vetting and identification at the local level as compared to international partners. But the first thing would be the fit of the organization with one's own program and organization. In other words, if you're talking about a large organization like the World Bank or WHO or Save the Children, with a lot of complicated procedures and rules and regulations, you probably need a larger and more established national partner that has some experience with all of that. In turn, if your organization is more flexible and fluid and more able to respond broadly across the board of a smaller organization in the field, then you can look for that kind of organization. But the fit of the organization to one's own organizational culture and style is important. Secondly, I would say endorsements from trusted intermediaries at the country level. So if I were looking for viable partners on new personal digital assistant diagnostic devices and software programs, I would definitely want to talk to partners that we already knew, maybe in the ministries, in donor agencies, and ask them, who have you worked with that has delivered, who's trustworthy, et cetera, in this space that I'm looking at. Obviously, the track record of the organization, has it been around for a number of years? Has it carried out reliably? Similar kinds of programs would count. And finally, as Lisa mentioned earlier in a different context, what we call due diligence is really key, meaning, what is the budget? What is the budgeting process? Is there a board? Who's on the board? Is it a family-dominated organization, or is it more objective? But there are more and more sources to go to now on that kind of background information, and there is no substitute for getting down, and particularly on finances, ensuring that you're clear that the organization has the capacity to thoroughly and honestly manage its finances. So those would be things that anyone should look at. And then large organizations, whether it's the Ford Foundation or CARE, tend to put an awful lot of time into each one of those, and also the reputation of the organization.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlie. And we'll next discuss a critical point about the difference between outputs and outcomes, which Lisa introduced earlier in this panel. As an example, an output can be described as the number of mosquito nets that might be distributed. An organization, for example, might proudly say that they distributed 10,000 mosquito nets. However, what does this mean? Are the mosquito nets being used to reduce malaria, or are those mosquito nets being used as fishing nets or soccer goals, as we see in these images on the webinar screen? So it's important that the organization not be touting the number of mosquito nets distributed, but instead should measure and highlight the reduction of malaria due to the distribution of those mosquito nets. So that would be the outcome. Are those mosquito nets reducing malaria? Anyone seeking to design a program must focus on their outcomes, which is why we describe, for example, on the GHIC Innovation Prize website, the importance of a specific plan to measure outcomes and not just outputs. And Lisa, can you describe why it's so important for outcome measurement plans to be included in all programs and program designs, and what are some common pitfalls when outcomes are omitted?
Thanks, Jennifer. So this is actually not necessarily a simple and I'm going to perhaps push back a little bit to say the answer is it depends, and it depends a little bit on how you measure your outcomes. So, for example, we know that mosquito nets properly used reduce malaria. And if you don't see an impact on malaria, for example, the answer is, are they not being properly used? But I could actually turn that around and say perhaps your outcome is not distribution of bed nets, but it's the appropriate and proper use of bed nets, and that not necessarily measuring change in something like malaria, which is an expensive thing to measure and something that you need to actually make sure you know how to actually measure it, so that you're actually capturing all the cases that you need. So I think for me the answer is you need to figure out how much evidence do you have that what you're doing, if it makes the changes you need, actually will result in an outcome. So if you're not actually sure it's something novel, you're going to actually have to measure some sort of health benefit. But if you're doing something, we had a webinar this morning, for example, that there's much follow-up information on GHB Online about hand washing to ultimately reduce infections. If we know, we've known for 200 years that if you wash your hands properly, that it will reduce infections. So for that, you need to figure out how do you measure whether people are washing their hands properly. So the outcome you choose depends on a combination of the evidence that you have as well as your ability to measure that change in an outcome. And so I think it's something that I would just caution people to say, talk to somebody that has some experience in this, that understands what it costs to actually capture the outcome, and that you need to figure out what is what we call perfectly good enough. But it has to be good enough to know that you're actually working. So don't measure mosquito nets being distributed. You may not be able to measure a drop in malaria, but you need to figure out that interim measure that is a good enough outcome, such as mosquito nets being appropriately and properly used in every house.
Terrific. Thank you, Lisa. And another question for you, Lisa. How can very early stage ideas and ventures incorporate concrete and effective plans for outcomes?
So I'm not too sure whether that means effective plans for getting outcomes or for measuring outcomes. So I think we'll try to sort of address these two types of things and perhaps cover another follow-on question that I sort of see here, which is that when you're planning anything, you need to look and define success. And I'm always fascinated when I ask people, well, how would you define success with this particular innovation? That it becomes, well, I've developed the innovation and people are using it, as opposed to what is the change that you actually want to see happen. So I think for me, it's almost starting all the way at the end and then working your way back, which is what is it you want to have happen, and then making sure that your innovation is working towards that. Again, it's this idea of starting with the problem, not with the solution. I think in terms of measurement, for very early stages ideas, it's very difficult to actually measure an impact on outcomes. And again, I think we tend to use frameworks such as logic models or other types of actually help people understand what are the steps that need to happen, the drivers that will actually result in the change you want to see, and then figure out how far down that path you need to measure for very early stage ideas to see whether or not it's even starting to go in the proper direction.
Great, Lisa. And actually, one additional question for you. How should outcome measurements be incorporated into technology ventures?
Where's Bobby when you need him? So I think that, again, it starts with that the idea of why do you want people to use this technology? What is the change that you hope to see happen? And that is the kind of outcome that we want to have. So, again, if you're developing something like an app to improve adherence, is it just that people are actually using the app, or is it you're actually changing the behavior of people? And I think that's a critical thing, is start with what is success, start with what is the change, figure out how far down the path you can measure towards that, but plan for that from the very beginning. And as importantly as identifying the outcomes, figure out, how do you define that indicator, make sure it's what we call a smart indicator. How are you going to collect the data in a way that is rigorous enough? And what kind of evidence, what's the design by which you want to actually measure this change? Are you going to go so far as a randomized controlled trial? Are you going to use some of the quasi-experimental designs? Or are you just going to do it by observation and hope that that's good enough? And I would be be careful about doing that when you're actually trying to scale something up. But plan ahead and always make sure that you know what is success and how you're going to measure it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa, for all of your insight on the outcomes. Charlie, what do prospective supporters look for when determining whether a program will be able to develop or scale appropriately and effectively?
Good question. An awful lot of proposals and thoughts and initiatives don't really address the question of scale. And a lot of good things are done on a very limited basis and don't resolve the larger underlying issue. So one thing is to be sure you've addressed the question of scale and not ignored it and just say we're going to do a single case in Uganda, and that's our proposal. A second is simply the making sure the conceptual framework, the cost structure, the complexity of management and administration, the breadth and multinational nature of the program are identified. And I'll take last year's winner, the Miracle Feet brace for clubfoot. It was clubfoot is a widespread problem. The brace was very low cost and easily affordable. The difficulty of producing it was very actually simple, and there were plans and partners in a multiple of countries that would be available to help with the distribution, follow-up, and so on and so forth. So that proposal built rollout at scale right into the original pitch. And as I say, the conceptual framework was not one of a one-off case example, but included the broader rollout plan. In that plan, and in any plan, if you've got larger partners that are interested in your idea, that are operating in several relevant countries, who would be willing to take your pilot and implement it off of their platform. If you can get that up front, then that obviously strengthens the scalability of the program. And going back to the partnering, if someone can get a CARE or an MSF or an Oxfam to agree to kind of co-sponsor the program, that solves several scaling problems. And finally, if it's an initiative that actually has direct market potential, if you can have low-income people pay a portion of the cost or all of the cost, then that gets an innovation out of the constant need for foundation or other subsidies. So those would all be things I would look for in looking to see whether a proposal was scalable or not.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlie. And Jordan, what do you wish that you had known prior to developing an organization?
Well, pretty much everything, because it comes down to a lot of what's been said so far today about the intricacies of whether it's monitoring, evaluation, scale, and I'd like to add on human resources, fundraising, politics, local context. I think the comments about things being experiential were especially important to this question. There are things that certainly I would have liked to have known or been taught, but I do also believe that diving in sometimes is the only way to learn these things in a true and meaningful way that can affect the outcomes of your organization and of your efforts. Sometimes it does take, for lack of a better word, a failure or a challenge to learn something, because when you get on the ground and you're trying to roll out something that may be an innovative idea, as we're talking about here, some of the amazing ideas that we saw last year when judging the panel, for example, you're only going to learn that they don't work through going through them. And also you might only come to the true solution by working through it, through trial and error, by putting something out there, by getting reaction from your target group, from your community. And listening to different people guide you through the way of an assumption you made that might have to be undercut by sometimes having to go right back to the beginning and start over, even though you have so much confidence in the idea. I wish I would have known more about how to manage people. It is essential. Very often a brilliant idea is led by kind of a visionary person, and they want to drive forward. But no idea will go to scale, and that depends upon many different ways of defining scale, but whether you're after getting out there and reaching a lot of people or how deeply you want to reach people, no idea is going to go to scale through one person. You're going to have to attract people to believe in your vision and to work in such a way that's going to create a machinery that can actually drive this innovation and drive your organization. And in order to do that, you're really going to have to manage people. You're going to have to realize that they want to join you because of the passion they have for your objective, but also many of them will be involved in a career and managing their own lives and want to see how their individual work is affecting the ultimate outcome. And in order to do that, you have to create real practical systems. Also, I believe Charlie was speaking about the finances of an organization to get to scale and to achieve your vision. So often those of us who get involved don't understand all those multiple layers. On today's call, we talked about monitoring and evaluation and how to start defining how you actually have an impact on something, how you create an outcome, how far down the road you have to project, how you have to look at a business plan. All of these things are absolutely essential, and they're actually quite difficult to build. So I think an education around all of these topics is essential. I don't think there's anything wrong with certain types of schooling, whether it's business school or otherwise, to give you the right foundation for this. But then truly, if you're going to lead at some point, it's essential that you get out on the ground and that you experience some bumps in the road and really practically see how you get around them and experience some local feedback and things like that, because that's what's going to be your best teacher.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jordan. And a question for Charlie. If you make executive decisions in order to move a process along, what strategies do you use to generate buy-in?
You operate very carefully, but more specifically, I certainly always felt that a quite thorough participatory strategic planning process that involved as many teammates as possible was time very well spent. It meant that people owned the framework of the individual discrete decisions, and they understood the larger context within which individual decisions were being made. So I put a huge amount of effort into establishing that ownership of the 3 or 5 year strategic direction. Secondly, I would always explain how the particular decision fit into that larger framework. So it wasn't a surprise, and it wasn't random, and it wasn't untransparent. Therefore, people could link the executive decision to the broader decisions they had already been part of. Thirdly, if it was possible, I would consult with a range of people who would be impacted by the decision. And because, number one, the decision is usually better, and number two, people are more willing to accept it. Now, typically, you get a range of different opinions, and some of them are contradictory. So that's that. But in that case, I would also say, listen, I've listened to the 25 or 30 or 40 people, and it seems like the consensus is X. I understand not everybody wants X, but we just can't, we can't continue to go round and round on this. We're not going to have a consensus, so it's now up to me as the decision maker to move things forward. But I have listened to you all, and I'm not making this in an arbitrary way. So all of those things, I believe, reduce arbitrariness and a lack of transparency, and do help decisions that have to be made to be accepted even when people might individually disagree with them.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Charlie. And Jordan, social entrepreneurs are often so excited about their ideas that it's hard to notice signs that they're not moving in the right direction. What is a good signal that you should stop moving forward with an idea or shift gears?
Well, I think, we talked about buy-in. And I think that's one of the key factors in understanding if you're going to be able to make progress. As I was speaking about before, one person by themselves can't completely drive innovation. There has to become a community around this idea. And when you get into, let's say, building an organization or a company, that community has to consist of a diverse group of stakeholders. You're going to need your people around you, those who kind of work with the organization to make it happen. You're going to need your funders in certain contexts. You're going to need your clients or consumers as well to believe in the idea. And I'm not suggesting in any way that if at the beginning of an idea you run into opposition or a lack of belief that you should, let's say, give up or not go through with it. In fact, you will run into that opposition at one point or another. But the key is that you got to keep going, but you need to make sure that other people are coming on board as you do it, and you have to come up with clear strategies as how to become a leader in this area. And often it's adjusting certain parts of the skill set. Often I've seen visionary leaders who are great at articulating a case and bring a ton of charisma to the table. But it's not necessarily the same skill set as sitting down with other people and getting their input into the situation and managing them towards what they can contribute. Also getting consumer feedback, so to speak. So when you start seeing that your community is breaking down, or when you start seeing that you're not able to generate a larger working community with different stakeholders, you may want to reassess kind of your business plan and how you're going about doing it. If you feel as though you're constantly hitting your head against the wall and you feel very alone and isolated, which can happen under the best of conditions, under the best of intentions, it may be time to sit down and reassess how you're reaching out to the key stakeholders, and have you considered who those key stakeholders are?
Great. Thank you so much, Jordan. And we have time for one more question. Paul, if someone has what they think is a great idea, very impactful to communities and potentially can really solve a problem, but there's no identified revenue stream, what do you suggest for someone who doesn't have a specifically identified revenue stream where they would need to reach out more specifically to donors and philanthropists?
Really, really good question. I think, again, part of this around innovation is, doing things differently, bringing new products to market, new services. Probably one of the most dynamic areas in social innovation today is the funding models. So, even conventional approaches, where you go out and get the funding maybe for the prototype or for the pilot, and you've got everything else lined up in terms of your scaling plans and your sustainable. There are so many different financial models, coming out today that, again, are sort of testing the assumptions around, who actually values the services or the products that are being offered. A really interesting area, in fact, is called corporate venturing and impact investing, where, for example, governments in particular on the impact investing, are interested in bringing private sector solutions and services to what would have traditionally been, public service provided, services, and so now looking at different models of how that might be funded by the government. Same in terms of, corporate venturing, in terms of, looking at, new and unique ways of investing for R&D. I'll give you an example that, one of the NGOs that I've worked with, as well as with HP, from the corporate side, there is a whole technology platform for assessing, why families are in poverty. This is done through a group called Foundation Paraguay. It was a product and a service that HP had invested in effect, provided this as a free service to the NGO, but then was able to take that innovation and create a whole different, data platform, that they were then able to market as a revenue stream. So again, looking at some of these, more unconventional or non-traditional approaches, where there might be other revenue streams that you're not even aware of, bringing in some of the financial innovation into the model and checking with partners that might be able to take that in another direction, are other ways, to find new revenue streams and make your solutions financially viable as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to all of our phenomenal panelists and for all of the expertise, guidance, and advice that they have shared with our audience today. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much to all.